Good morning, everyone. I'm Dick Levinson. On behalf of the Senior Center here at Central, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our program this morning. Our focus today is on the plight of California's long-term senior senator, Dianne Feinstein. And our guest this morning is Rebecca Traister. She is an award-winning journalist and author. She's a staff writer at New York Magazine, and she's published 3 books, the latest of which, Good and Mad, has become a New York Times bestseller. Now, I have to say that we're going to depart from our usual routine this morning. There will be no lecture or formal presentation. Instead, while we have Rebecca here, I'm going to use my prerogative as the host to ask her a number of questions. And then later, folks in the audience will certainly have their chance to ask whatever they would like. Now, before we get started, there are a couple of points I want to touch on briefly. First, I need to tell you that our next program is coming up on Wednesday, October 26th at 11 o'clock. And if you love Broadway musicals, this program is for you. It's called Forgotten Broadway. Shows that flopped, closed early, or sank without a trace, but maybe worth a second look. So I think if you do love Broadway musicals, you'll be intrigued to hear what our guest, David Fox from Penn's Theater Arts Department, has to say. And then finally, a reminder that you can send your own questions to Rebecca at any point during the program this morning. Just look for the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. That's where you would go to type a question for Rebecca. She's happy to respond to your questions and will later in the morning. So with that said, let's plunge in. Rebecca, as you know, Death of a Salesman is currently being revived on Broadway. And I was thinking about that because the play includes this beautiful speech by Willy Loman's wife, Linda, where she says, attention must be paid, and talks about the fact that he shouldn't be allowed to just fall into his grave like some old dog. And, I realized that in some respects, you really can't compare Dianne Feinstein, who was born into a wealthy family, with Willy Loman, who never got a break in his life. But I was thinking about the two of them because now, of course, Dianne Feinstein is helpless and vulnerable. And given the fact that she devoted her whole life to public service, don't we owe her something?
Hi, Dick. Thank you so much for having me. And what a great and provocative first question. And it's interesting because in the months that I spent writing this very long profile of Dianne Feinstein that ran in the spring, I actually hadn't lingered on Death of a Salesman, and I wonder if it's because it was a play that I always found almost unbearably sad, right? I mean, I'm not unusual in that reaction, but it's one of those, it's interesting that didn't come back to me. And I think it's a really fascinating reference point for Feinstein, but I would differ with you in one characterization of Feinstein, and you pointed out that there's a difference in their origins, that Willy Loman versus Dianne Feinstein, who was raised in an extremely rarefied and wealthy world in San Francisco, like that you can't make that kind of comparison. I think I would also differ with you on your characterization of her current status as weak and vulnerable. She's a sitting U.S. senator, and she continues to serve on the committees that make determinations about who's going to be on the Supreme Court. She is not powerless. She's far from it. She's one of the 100 most powerful people in the country. And yes, she is aging, and there's a lot of reporting, and we should talk about the stuff that I found as I was reporting on her that suggests that her health is deteriorating, and that's true, but her power at the moment has not deteriorated. She is still sitting in that Senate seat that she's occupied. since 1993 when she was sworn in.
Let me ask you, I mean, I'm intrigued by the point that you just raised. Let me ask you, I mean, as somebody who knows much less about this than you do, as a practical matter, is the current senator from California a member of Senator Feinstein's staff or several staff people? I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is Feinstein is certainly sitting in the seat. Who is making the decisions about voting and how to vote?
Well, I can't say that with any kind. I mean, I don't think anybody knows that about Feinstein, or to be very frank, about any number of the people who are sitting in Senate seats, right? Every lawmaker and politician takes a different approach to their own decision making and lawmaking, right? And there are probably a lot of senators out there who lean heavily on staffers to come up with policy positions, to write their speeches, and then others who are very much in control of their own voting, their own ideological positions, right? And I don't think that anybody except those in her office who did not speak to me freely about that could say with any kind of authority exactly where that power is. But here's what is true. For example, she does have power and reach in terms of how she sends messages. And two examples from recent years that are really important were an instance in which she scolded young environmental activists in her office, and there was a lot of videotape of that. That's Dianne Feinstein. That's nobody else telling her to say those things. But there were a group of young teenage Sunrise Movement activists who came to her office to push for more stringent policy when it comes to climate change. And she chided them and spoke down to them. So and that's an instance in which the voice of a sitting California senator to a group of young environmentalists, that has real power and reach and conveys certain messages. The other instance that many people, including me, have taken note of is in the fall of 2020, at the conclusion of the confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett, who of course was the sort of the rush to confirm a replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg that is completely at odds with the way that Republicans held a Supreme Court seat open after the death of Antonin Scalia, so that it could be filled by Donald Trump. The reverse of that happened in the fall of 2020 after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in late September, and Republicans pushed through Amy Coney Barrett as his replacement, and of course, extra ensuring a strongly conservative court and all kinds of decisions, including the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe. And Dianne Feinstein has been a senior member of the Senate Judiciary Committee since she came to the Senate in 1992. In fact, she was put there in part as a kind of apology for the all-male, all-white Senate Judiciary Committee on both Republican and Democratic sides that behaved so poorly during the Clarence Thomas hearings and the treatment and their ill treatment of Anita Hill in '91. Dianne Feinstein came to office in the next election cycle, and Joe Biden, the head of the Judiciary Committee at the time, put her and Carol Moseley Brown on the Judiciary Committee as a kind of apology and to fix the all maleness and all whiteness. Okay, so she's sat there since '92. And in the wake of this rushed through confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, she hugged Lindsey Graham, the Republican, and her peer on that committee, and said, "This is the best set of hearings I can remember." That's Dianne Feinstein. That's not her staff, right? That's Dianne Feinstein sending an incredibly damaging message. That's a voice of the Democratic Party in a moment in which they have been rolled over by Republicans, in a moment in advance of which many of the progressive reforms, including the right to reproductive health care and access, likely the rights to, possibly in the future, marriage equality, all this stuff is on the line judicially, thanks to this appointment of Amy Coney Barrett and the rush to fill that seat. And Dianne Feinstein, as a senior avatar of the Democratic Party, isn't saying this has been done badly. This has been, this is hypocrisy. These are double standards. She is saying this is the best version, this is the best hearings I've seen. That's her having power. That's her having communicative, and I would argue damaging power within the Democratic Party.
Right. So, as I'm listening to what you're saying, I mean, what occurs to me to ask right off the bat is, where is Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in all this?
Well, I will say that after those 2020 hearings, he did ask her to take a step down in terms of seniority on the Judiciary Committee, but that's, sort of like what is it? The horse is already out of the barn. I'm getting that wrong, but it's a little too little and a little too late. It's a great question. Feinstein's, there was a moment in which I think party leadership could have urged her to not run again. She ran for reelection in 2018 and had a very challenging primary opponent, a younger and more left opponent. And I think that leadership within the Democratic caucus probably could have and should have been more forceful in encouraging her to not run for reelection at that point. But whether they tried and didn't get anywhere, or whether they simply didn't try, I don't know the answer to that. But this is, the leadership in both parties is older. There are a lot of members of the Senate who have been sitting there, for decades at this point. And there is, I think, a lot of internal frustration from younger Democrats that there has not been room made for younger leadership. And there's an open question: is that fair? Is that unfair? What comes with seniority? What kinds of wisdom, experience, and power come with long tenures, right? This is not, I want to be really wary of making an argument that's ageist, but it is also very rational to question a legislative body that is, on average, as aged as it is.
So, when I listened to what you just said, there were really two things that occurred to me simultaneously. I know that Feinstein's husband, I guess maybe her third husband, Richard Blum, had passed away, but it does raise, first of all, the question of, where is her family? Why aren't her surviving relatives attempting to take a role here and help when she really needs help? And then the other thing I wanted to ask, based on what you just said, is, what does this one case say about the current US Senate as an institution?
Well, so in answer to your first question about where is her family, I don't know the answer to that. When I was reporting this story, there was sort of, I should be clear in explaining to people listening how I reported this particular story, because every reporter takes a different path and it's a different timeline. This was a case where I actually worked for about 3 months on this story. I don't always get that kind of time. Because I didn't expect her office to necessarily cooperate in any way. And I immediately, as soon as I got the assignment, I contacted her office and said, I'm writing this profile of Senator Feinstein. I would love to speak to anybody in the office or to the senator herself for this story. They never even responded to me over the course of months. And I'll get to the end of this soon. But so for several months, I was reporting without any, not only openness from her office, but no acknowledgement whatsoever of the story that I was working on. And I did make I contacted lots of people, as a reporter does, tried to find people who knew her, who'd worked with her. I will tell you that I did not hear back from her family, who I made attempts to contact. And at the very last minute, literally in the last 2 weeks of writing this piece, I expected to write it without her participation. That didn't come as a surprise to me. I knew from reporting that had been done, even while I was doing my own reporting, that there was increasing criticism and scrutiny into what might be her cognitive decline, and that her office was reacting defensively. So I didn't expect any participation from them. Then in the final 2 weeks of the story, out of the blue, I heard back from them. And they said they wanted to put her on the phone with me. And so in the days before this story published, I spoke to her by phone, and I described that in the piece. But I didn't have contact with her family. That said, there were, and this is not in the piece, and so I say this advisedly, I did hear rumors that her family is concerned, and it is entirely and aware of these issues. It would be impossible not to be aware. And it's very hard to determine if you're not actually witness to those family dynamics. I think we all know from our family dynamics that these kinds of discussions are complicated, difficult, painful, and that you cannot necessarily, you can't control somebody, right? Even within your own family. And I don't know whether there's actually an attempt to suggest to her that she should step down. But if there is, she's obviously resisting it. And okay, so that's the first part. The second part that you ask is very interesting, because I've come across this in a couple of my reporting projects around senators with seniority, including Susan Collins, the senator from Maine, right, where the issues are not cognitive, but the arguments for keeping somebody, even if there are levels of dissatisfaction with them. And in Maine, for example, there's political dissatisfaction with Susan Collins. In California, there is both political dissatisfaction with Dianne Feinstein, who is now, I think, more conservative than a lot of the California political, she's to the center of a lot of California right now. So she's not necessarily representative of them ideologically. So there's that kind of pressure. And then there is also the pressure because of her age and reports of her decline. But the Senate is an institution that rewards seniority in a way that is very, very difficult to argue against, and I think sets up situations like this, so that the longer you serve, the more power you accrue. And therefore, regardless of your performance or whether or not you're a great match for your constituents anymore, what you do have, if you are a long-sitting senator, is seniority on committees that enables you to direct resources to your state. So, and I've reported on this again, not just with Feinstein, but with somebody like Susan Collins, where you might be very dissatisfied with your senator, but what that senator can say in response is, well, if you get somebody new, they're going to be junior on the appropriations committee, and so you're not going to get that new public works that you need. You're not going to get the funding for schools or for municipal, all that. The institution encourages people to stay well beyond any reasonable length, because you just get more and more and more power the longer you stay. And it creates incentives for people to never leave. And I think that creates the logjam where you have a younger generation that wants to come and perhaps do things differently, and bring different kinds of energy and different kinds of ideas about a future into the Senate. And yet that younger generation is faced with a very real argument, which is, okay, kids, you can get here, but you're not going to have the power to deliver for your state in the way that those who've already been here for 50 years have the power to deliver.
Let me ask you, if Feinstein had opted to retire before, the current set of questions and issues about her capability were front and center, what would her legacy have been?
It's interesting. So she's always loomed very large. I write about women in politics, and Feinstein has always loomed very large. Now, I'm the kind of reporter who gets to be very open about my own political leanings, right? So it's fair to say that my personal politics are to the left of Feinstein's. However, her story is remarkable. It is one of breaking all kinds of boundaries for women in politics. She is part of this group of women who came to the Senate in historic numbers, and that number is 4 in 1992. I mentioned this earlier, but in the wake of the treatment of Anita Hill's testimony and Anita Hill herself by this all-white, all-male Senate Judiciary Committee, certainly the horrible treatment of Hill by Republicans and the failure to defend her or treat her humanely by the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee. There was an enormous amount of anger in 1992, and a historic number of women ran for the Senate, and this historic number, 4 of them, won. And in California, it was particularly notable because 2 of those 4 were from California, Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer. And it was the first time that 2 women had represented a state. You know, Feinstein, her career has been so long that there are a couple of different ways that I think her legacy would have resonated. So that's one, is this sort of a history maker as a woman and a first woman and part of that wave. A vociferous defender of abortion rights, although it's interesting, in going back and writing about her youth, I also discovered that before she got into politics, she served on the California Women's Sentencing and Parole Board, where she actually was in a position before Roe v. Wade of sentencing abortion providers, which is very interesting given that a lot of her later political career was as a pro-choice politician. She also, in later years, really looked into the CIA's torture tactics in a way that I think was surprising to a lot of people, because Feinstein's part of her reputation is as a real institutionalist, right? And that's part of what I write about in this piece. She really believes in the institutions of American government, and she believes in their power for good, and she likes hierarchies, and she likes that's very much who she is as a politician. And yet she went to town and, you know, it really broke with her own sort of reverence for these government institutions by initiating and pushing for investigation into the CIA's tactics. And I think that would have been a big part of her legacy in the later years, especially had she stepped away sooner.
Rebecca, can you think of a story about Dianne Feinstein that offers real insight into her character and personality? And I'm speaking of the Dianne Feinstein in her prime.
You mean a story about her political approach, or who she is as a human being?
That's what I'm really trying to get to. What we know about Dianne Feinstein as a human being.
Well, a lot of it is stuff that she's such a person I learned so much writing about her, right? Because again, I knew her mostly as a politician from the time she entered the Senate in 1993. And I mean, that was I haven't ever lived in California. I also knew that she had been mayor of San Francisco through a lot of years. And we haven't talked about this yet, the amount of history that Dianne Feinstein was sort of at the center of. And she offers a lot of contradiction. And I'm trying to think of a story. So she became she ran to be mayor of San Francisco several times. She was on that city's board of supervisors, and again was not the first woman, but the youngest woman ever elected to the board of supervisors in San Francisco, and served there for a long time, and ran for mayor twice and lost, and was about to retire. And from politics, and say that she was not going to run for mayor ever again. On the day that a former colleague of hers from the Board of Supervisors, Dan White, entered San Francisco's City Hall and shot and killed her fellow member of the Board of Supervisors, Harvey Milk, who was the first openly gay member of that board, and the mayor, George Moscone. And on that day, Dianne Feinstein was there in the building as Dan White killed her 2 colleagues. And that night she became mayor. And it's fascinating because in San Francisco, a very liberal, left liberal city, or at least it's, that's its reputation. Uh, Even those who don't like the sort of centrist way that Dianne Feinstein governs as senator, they still speak with tremendous admiration of the years, both her when she became mayor and sort of held the city together. And really, like, left activists talked to me about this. People who cannot stand Dianne Feinstein in the Senate talked with enormous warmth about the work she did to keep San Francisco together in the wake of those assassinations, and also how she steered it through the AIDS crisis. And so there is this, people loved Mayor Dianne Feinstein, for example, far more than New York's mayor, Ed Koch, who was widely criticized for how badly he handled the AIDS crisis in New York City. So here is this person whose leadership in a period of rampant homophobia and a public health crisis is still hailed by many gay activists, right? She was also criticized by gay activists. I want to be clear, right? It was very controversial to be leading the city at that time. She made choices that were both sort of heroic and deplorable, right? Like but people even on the left still speak warmly about her, or spoke warmly to me about her. And yet, she will still speak about Dan White, her fellow, the man who served with her on the Board of Supervisors and was quite conservative and was a former cop. She will still speak about him with a kind of confusion that a guy who was a cop, who was a part of this city institution, she loved cops, she loved firefighters, could have done something so terrible. She can't. So that, to me, it's that contradiction that to me exemplifies what's so interesting about her, the length of her career, in that she really, really does trust in these institutions, right? She trusts in the Senate. She trusts in the police department, even when her career has been shaped by people within those institutions having literally committed murders in front of her. When the past 10 years of her time on the Senate has been the Senate perverting the political process around Supreme Court appointments, for example, right? She has sat on a judiciary committee as the body that she reveres, the Senate, has held a president's ability to select a Supreme Court justice hostage. And yet she can still revere the institutions and seemingly be perplexed that there's anything wrong with them. And so that's what I think of. I mean, I don't know that it's such a great story, but that's the contradiction of Dianne Feinstein in my mind.
Wow. Because we're talking about her history and her career, one thing I wanted to touch on, at least briefly, is when Walter Mondale ran for president in '84, everything was against him. He needed something dramatic to change the calculus of the situation. Decided that he wanted a woman to run with him as vice president. Dianne Feinstein, along with Geraldine Ferrero, were I think the two women at the end of the day that he considered most seriously. Do we know anything about why he did not choose Feinstein?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that I didn't get deep into the reporting on why he didn't choose Feinstein. I think that there are a number of factors that might have come into play. And I just want to say here that, again, this doesn't come from my own deep reporting on the subject. One thing about Dianne Feinstein is she's Jewish. We have to remember we have a very, very limited history of it. Already to have picked a woman is a big deal, and remember that however many years later, it was a huge deal when Al Gore picked Joe Lieberman as his running mate, and I just think that's worth pointing out. And no, I don't don't have a full and complete answer to that question about why Mondale went with Ferraro, but I do know that Feinstein very much wanted the job. She wanted to be vice president.
And ironically, as it turned out, I think Mondale would have been so much better off, had he gone with Feinstein instead of Ferraro.
Maybe. I don't know that anything, and I say this with sadness in my heart, I don't know that anything was going to save Walter Mondale in that election cycle. It was pretty grim.
Okay. How are we doing on time at this point?
About 5 more minutes.
Okay. All right. So this is the point where absolutely want to make sure that this gets covered. Based on all the research, the writing, the thinking, the reporting that you've done, what are the most important lessons that conscientious American citizens, people who care about good government, should take away from this episode?
That's a great question. I think that we should all think a lot, and we should push for better coverage from the press, right? From people like me, to really investigate how institutions like the Senate work, right? We don't do a lot of thinking about what kinds of incentives are in place and to have people stay longer than they should. A lot of people don't want to think too hard about how our government institutions function and how they themselves can distort representation. And I'd say that's not just about the Senate and how it works. It's about how democracy itself works, right? I think too many of us don't think hard enough about the kinds of power that the Electoral College confers, right? And how and what the Electoral College was created to do, and how that continues to be its function. We don't talk enough about how the Senate itself is a distortion of power, because every state has 2 senators, and there's such a disproportionate representation of such a few number of people, while states that are hugely populated, wind up with the same level of the representation as those that are sparsely populated. The thing that I wish for myself too, and I'm somebody who had an excellent education and a very expensive one, is that I had been pushed from a young age to think more critically about how our government is structured and the ways that power is inequitably distributed within the institutions that we just sort of, we go and we vote for the people, and we don't think too much about what it means once they're there, or how that kind of representation works. And I think we're at a moment where there are a series of crises in our democracy that are prompting a lot of us to think differently about the makeup of the court, about Senate rules, filibuster rules, about how the Senate functions, and about who's allowed to vote, about gerrymandering, about mapping, votes. All these kinds of crises are upon us, and now many of us are getting a crash course in this. And so I guess in a very basic way, I would love for all of us to get like a very, a civic education that is better than the one I got, even with my excellent education. As far as Feinstein herself, I would also say that I wish we had more nuanced coverage of the people who lead us. We tend to, a news media, political media tends to deal in caricatures of people. And those caricatures work to make them sometimes seem more one-dimensionally malevolent and sometimes more one-dimensionally heroic than they actually are. The people who represent us are human beings, and they have many of the strengths and weaknesses and flaws and talents that they're regular human beings. And I think we have to think more critically about them as human beings.
So are we at a point now where we should make the switch?
Yeah. So
Okay.
in fact, based on what Rebecca has just said, I think Jeffrey Dice asks a few questions that feel highly related. I'll read them aloud. Seniority has always been very important for power in the US Senate. So even if Senator Feinstein's capabilities are lessened, isn't there a compensating factor in that her long tenure confers that makes her still quite an effective representative for her state's interests. And I would add here, he asks too, what is the political calculus for Democrats? If she retired, Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom will appoint a Democratic replacement, but create an incumbency that will be likely to continue for years versus wait for the next election cycle and allow a likely Democrat replace her via a vote of the people of the state.
Mm-hmm. So to the first one, that to the first half of that question, that is exactly what I was getting at with the description of how seniority works. So Feinstein's defenders, and this happened during the 2018 race when she did have a really robust challenge coming from the left, from a younger and more progressive politician, Kevin DeLeon. And what her defenders argued, and argued to me still this summer, or this spring, is that the compensation is absolutely there in terms of what she's able to get for her state, having such seniority within that body, and that there's no younger senator who's going to be able to achieve more for Californians than the person who's been sitting there since 1992, who is Dianne Feinstein, and whatever her liabilities are in terms of her health or her cognitive abilities, her simple body in that body is gonna bring money and investments into her state in a way that is inarguable. And that's not wrong, but that creates this structural problem if you do want to bring new leadership in. And that's a question of, you can have ideological differences about, well, I don't know if I want these young, more radical people in there. Okay, fine. But actually, you're not, at this point, as senators are living longer and serving ever longer, you're not building a team. You're not, whatever the sports metaphor is, you're not building.
Right, there's no bench.
Yeah. And, you're not setting people up to have long lives in leadership. And you have a generation that's been largely shut out of that leadership over a period of really crucial years in which we see so many, there's so much political precarity right now. And the generation that is in leadership throughout this precarity has in fact been in leadership for decades. And I think it's a genuine problem. But as you point out, the argument for her staying is rational according to the rules of the Senate. And so both of those things can be true at the same time. As for what happens should she step down. So I did think this spring, when there was a lot of reporting, again, I was working on this piece, it had not yet been published, when her hometown newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle, started publishing pieces that were very directly, that suggesting that she was not recognizing people in hallways, that she had to be refreshed on briefings constantly, again, suggesting, as Dick did, that her staff was doing a lot of propping up of Feinstein herself to compensate for her difficulties. And I did think at that point, as I was leading up to the publication of my article and afterwards, that there was a chance that she might step down this summer. I mean, it seemed like there was an enormous amount of pressure being applied, including in her hometown newspaper. And again, in San Francisco, there is a kind of almost weird devotion to Dianne Feinstein. There's a deep loyalty there. It was a big deal for the Chronicle to publish that piece, questioning her health. And at that point, I thought, maybe she'll go. And I think it's possible at any time, but I also think that it's 2 more years at this point. And, both of the possibilities that you outline are real. Newsom could appoint somebody, and then there'd be a special election I believe, I'd have to check all the rules, but there'd be an election in 24. And that is one possibility. I don't know that it's for certain that it would set up years of incumbency. It's possible that happens sometimes, but California is a very politically engaged state, and if they wanted somebody else, they might push for that person in 2024. But I also think it's very possible that she sticks through till 24. And then there is a fresh election.
There is one follow-up question from Jeff too, which is how does her attendance record compare with other senators? Is she showing up for votes and committee hearings?
Yeah, she's showing up. I haven't checked. I mean, I haven't checked in on that record in the past couple of months. But yeah, that's she sits in the seat and she makes her votes. And she's there. She's in the offices. She's very devoted to her work. This has been true from the time she was on. In fact, people used to bristle in San Francisco when she was a young woman and the youngest woman ever elected to the board in San Francisco. She's a workaholic. She works all the time. She would show up at the office. She came from a wealthy family and could support herself as a member of the Board of Supervisors, whereas lots of her colleagues who did not come from wealth, and it was meant to be a part-time job, had to work other jobs, and then did the Board of Supervisors thing as a part-time gig. And Dianne Feinstein, as a young woman, was there sort of all day, every day. And she turned it into a real full-time job. She reorganized it and, made it in many ways, much more professionally demanding to be a member of the Board of Supervisors because she worked. And that was, her devotion was to being in the office, late nights, early mornings, all the time. And one of the things that I gathered while reporting this piece is that whatever her health status, she's still at the office all the time. She's there.
Wow.
Alice Wells asked a really interesting question that reminds me of your analysis of her trust in institutions. Did anyone ask Dianne Feinstein why she was so pleased with the Amy Barrett hearings?
I think that if anybody asked her, it wasn't publicly, right? That was a thing that she said to Lindsey Graham that was audible because it was in public in the broadcast hearings. And then by and large, she doesn't grant interviews. Again, I was shocked that she got on the phone with me for my story. And she also she got on the phone with the San Francisco Chronicle in response to that reporting about her cognitive decline to sort of prove that she could still that she could engage in a conversation, but she doesn't typically grant interviews to the press, so that reporters who tried to contact her afterwards to get her to clarify her remarks did not necessarily get access to her. I would say, I mean, this is a guess. This is my interpretation of those remarks from the outside, based on the conversation I would have with her 2 years later. She, as I said, she remains very devoted to the processes, the hierarchies, the traditions, the rituals of institutions, including the Senate. And it seemed to me that and yet she's not, and I can say this given the nature of my conversation with her, in which she could talk about, for example, this is another one of her legacies, going back to an earlier question. She's fought very hard for control of automatic weapons. She's been a gun control advocate, in part coming out of her experience, having been present for the assassinations of two of her colleagues and having been the person who found Harvey Milk's body. And she talks about this openly, having gone in and found him on the floor and put her finger through the bullet hole in his wrist. She became a devoted fighter for gun control. And when I spoke to her in May, it was 2 days after the Uvalde murder of school children in Texas. And she could speak about gun control legislation, but she didn't seem aware that event had happened just a couple days ago. And my guess about the comments about the Amy Coney Barrett hearing is that she could recognize the rituals of the Senate that she was participating in, the conclusion of a hearing in which there was a confirmation of a Supreme Court justice, without necessarily being acutely aware of the circumstances under which this person had just been confirmed. And so to me, that comment jives with what I understand to be true about her awareness and engagement in the body she's participating in.
We do have a set of questions about cognitive ability right now, and they're broad. First, let me read a statement from Barbara Chernak, who says, mentally incompetent senators have no place staying in office, therefore not enabling new senators to come on the scene and eventually elevate to seniority position. But an anonymous attendee asks several questions along this line. We concentrate so much on Feinstein, which I can understand, but what about mentally deranged people in Congress like Marjorie Taylor Greene, or obviously incompetent, possibly elected former football player Herschel Walker in Georgia? Was Strom Thurmond capable to the end of his long tenure? There are a number of young, irrational people, not just in Congress. What is the role of family and friends and colleagues in being open as an advisor about a senator or a congressional representative?
So that's a really fascinating set of questions that I think are really relevant. I was going to bring up Herschel Walker, and Herschel Walker is a candidate for the Senate seat in Georgia running against Raphael Warnock. And he has often sounded confused, given misstatements. He's a former football player. I think that there are questions about his cognitive abilities that are very valid. And yet, it's interesting talking about the kinds of rational defenses that are mounted on behalf of Feinstein, like, well, look at her seniority, look at what she can do, just being that warm body in that seat, she can move so much money. We have heard, if you've been paying attention to how the right wing is covering Herschel Walker and his many missteps, right? It's not, he both seems to have trouble in many instances expressing himself in a way that makes sense. And also he has all kinds of hypocrisies that he's a huge opponent of abortion rights and access, and yet has been revealed to have paid for several abortions himself. There are all kinds of inconsistencies ideologically, right? And yet we have heard, if you're paying attention to how the right wing is talking about him, his defender saying, I don't care at all about whether he paid for abortions, whether he's lying, whether he's cognitively impaired, as long as he is a Republican sitting in that seat. And if you care very much about pushing through a right-wing agenda, then you care very much about any warm body that is going to be voting for Republican policies, right? You care very much about who has control of the Senate. So from a right-wing perspective, all of the questions about whether it's Dianne Feinstein or Herschel Walker or Tommy Tuberville, another one, all those questions can get put aside for what you want. It's all a means to an end, and that end is power and control and the ability to control the future of the country, policy, legislation, democracy itself, right? And so those rationalizations in place cover for a lot of sins or potential weaknesses or vulnerabilities. Again, I can't speak to the role of friends and family, because friends and family, Herschel Walker's own family members are saying, we begged him not to do this, right? They're saying that publicly. Some of them are conservatives who are saying, we begged him not to do this, who are talking about how he physically abused his family members. I mean, that's a very, very ugly, sad situation happening in Georgia. And in that case, you have family members out there saying, we do not want him running for the seat. We do not want him winning. There are other instances, Mitch McConnell's family has objected to his candidacies at various points. We've seen instances in recent years in which political candidates have had their family members come out and say, please don't vote for our father or brother or husband or cousin or whatever. That has happened. It doesn't necessarily, that's not the answer. I don't know if we want to get into this or not, but just this week, I published a piece about John Fetterman. And there's an example of a candidate who is recovering from a stroke 4 months out, who is being grilled, and I think in many cases dishonestly, by a mainstream political press about his impairments, his physical and medical situation. And it is fascinating to watch the degree of scrutiny that John Fetterman is getting about his health, about his cognitive ability, and about his transparency, and compare that to how the same mainstream press is treating some other candidates, including Herschel Walker, including Chuck Grassley, who's running for re-election and is 89.
Mary Frankel also is thinking through a policy response to this and asks, what does Ms. Traster think of government rules applying to the Senate, the Supreme Court, all elected officials in general, requiring age or health limits to terms? Would that solve the dilemma?
Oh, I don't know if I can speak to what the correct solutions are here. I think I believe that I do believe in term limits on the Supreme Court. I think lifetime appointments are a problem when it comes to the Supreme Court. I think term limit questions get stickier around House and Senate. I think you have people of varying, and this is where you get to like what counts as a health requirement. You know, 2 sitting senators have had major strokes in this past year. Do we? I don't know the answers, right? I think that the medically there are ethical questions that would inevitably turn into partisan questions about when do we deem somebody unfit. You know, I think there are certain standards you could apply to the Senate right now that would wipe out 40% of them. And I'm not being facetious, actually. I don't know. And I also don't necessarily want to advocate for those. I think that you do have an aged body, but you see some of the people in that body. And I say this as somebody who, and I'm very clear about where I am ideologically, who despises Mitch McConnell. He is, I don't have his age in front of me, but he's over 80. I don't think anybody would argue that he's unfit at this point. And again, he's somebody who I find politically abhorrent, but he is very much in control, obviously very sharp. Elizabeth Warren is somebody who is an older senator who has the energy, I've covered her for years, has the energy of a 35-year-old, you know? So I think that sort of age limits sound appealing in some ways, but would also maybe not wind up getting exactly the being the solution that we might imagine them to be. But I agree that there needs to be some kind of structural reform. I don't think I'm the person who has the set of solutions at hand. It is worth it. I want to note that there's a really great book about the Senate and some of this stuff by Adam Jenelson. For those of you who are interested in that, I got to find the name of the book. Hold on. Kill Switch. Okay, this is really worth reading if you're interested in this. The book is called Kill Switch. It's Adam Jenelson, The Rise of it's the Rise of the Modern Senate, and it's fascinating. His last name is spelled Jentleson, and it's a really, really good look at the Senate's institutional limitations and the way that those institutional limitations are contributing to the erosion of our democracy.
Is there a point, is there some value in comparing and contrasting the very different cases of Dianne Feinstein and John Fetterman?
Yeah, it's been something that's been weighing on me a lot because I wrote this profile of Feinstein that came out in the spring, and then these past 6 weeks I have been following John Fetterman. And it's very unusual to have to be a political reporter who winds up in 2 stories sort of back to back, having to describe very carefully and precisely the exact nature of exchanges to make clear to readers what the cognitive and communicative realities are. But I will tell you that it is striking to me the amount of scrutiny that Fetterman is getting, when it was very clear to me watching him over the past 6 weeks that his arc is one of medical improvement. He suffered a stroke in May. It was a bad stroke. His doctor said he did not have any cognitive impairment, but he does have communicative challenges in that he has a hard time processing what he hears. So when I did an interview with him, we did it using closed captioning technology. I know that there's closed captioning enabled on the conversation we're having right now. It's a very common accommodation for people who have any kind of hearing challenges. And it was interesting because I thought we talked for an hour, and he had to read what I was saying, but he did it in real time. There were not pauses. There were not gaps. It was very clear that he understood every word I was saying. It's just that he had to comprehend them with his eyes, not his ears. And that is, I talked to a lot of doctors for my piece. It is getting better. His ability to speak, he could always speak, but he actually had a challenge hearing himself when he speak. Again, it's an auditory processing challenge. But it was so apparent to me, absolutely no question, that he was completely engaged, eloquent, responded in multi-clausal sentences. He does occasionally get words tangled or miss a word or get his syntax screwed up when he is speaking. But he was just absolutely no cognitive impairment whatsoever, just communicative challenges. And it was so different. And also watching him, I was in a rally in Montgomery County, September 11th. I then watched him at a rally in Bethlehem 2 weeks later. The difference was he was getting better. The arc was of recuperation and improvement. And you can see it, almost day by day because he's doing television interviews. He's being completely transparent about the technology that he uses. And the difference between that and covering Feinstein, where she had no problem, she could hear what I was saying and she could speak back to me, but there were real questions that I had about how much she was comprehending what we were actually talking about, how much she was actually aware of what had happened in Uvalde, Texas, how aware she was of where we were democratically or in a timeline or in terms of gun legislation or the impending overturn of Roe, which she didn't seem to have a handle on was the fact that was coming soon. And so the differences were very stark. And I would say that my view of Fetterman is that it was just, he was getting better and recovering at a really rapid rate in a way that's visible to people. And yet I watched the mainstream coverage of Fetterman with a lot of dismay because reporters, including not just on Fox News and in the right-wing media, but in the mainstream political media, are treating him as though he's hiding something. They're not being careful. He just did an interview on NBC where it was in person and you could see the reporter and his closed captioning technology. And the way the reporter described it afterwards was frankly inaccurate. She said he couldn't understand what I was saying. This is not an issue of understanding or comprehension. It's that he could not, she said, when we were doing small talk before the interview, he can't process what he hears. That's very different from not understanding. And so I'm watching a media that's clamoring for transparency from Fetterman actually wind up distorting the medical situation he's in the midst of by saying he's not understanding something rather than that he couldn't process it via hearing. So it's been very interesting writing about these two figures. And I would point out that they're both Democrats. Right? This is not me coming at this with a partisan lens. This is me evaluating two people and seeing just very different trajectories and seeing what I think is a very distorted light being shown on John Fetterman at the moment.
First of all, I want to thank you for what I think has been a fascinating program. I mean, I think the opportunities for people to learn and think, I mean, everything that the Free Library is supposed to promote and care about, it all happened during this discussion. So I want to thank you for that. I want to wrap up today by asking if you had heard from Senator Feinstein or anyone in her office or members of her family since your piece has been published.
No, and I want to say that I want to speak to a very strange thing about how that went. I mentioned earlier that in the months that I was reporting the piece and telling the office regularly that I was reporting the piece, I kept checking in and saying, I'm still writing. Can I come by? I was in Washington. I said, can I come by the office and speak to anybody there and tell you a little bit about the story I'm writing? I'm very open with people about what I'm doing. And I just would get no response, no response, no response, no response. And then at the very end, which is unusual. Usually I get declined all the time. You know, I'm a feminist journalist. Lots of people don't want to talk to me. But usually you get a no thanks, the senator won't be participating, or, you know, she's not going to be available this week. Or I got nothing, zero. And then in the weeks right before I published, as I said, out of the blue, it was just, she'll talk to you on Thursday. They never asked me when the piece was running, how long it was going to be. It was such a strange, which if you're a reporter, usually that's what a communications team for a senator asks is, when is this piece running? Who else are you talking to? You know, how long is it going to be? What kinds of stuff are you covering? They want to know the details. I got no questions from her office about what I was writing about, who I had spoken to, what my angle was, nothing like that. They simply put her on the phone with me. And then after the phone call, I never heard from them again. Not once, not a syllable. Wow. There was no attempt to make a factual correction. I mean, I don't think I made factual errors in the piece. There was no pushback. There was no response. Nothing. And all of that is very unusual, actually. Every single thing about what I just described from a journalistic point of view is extremely unusual.
Wow. Okay. Well, again, Rebecca, I want to thank you for a wonderful program today. I mean, I think so much learning and insight and some great stories. So thank you very much. It was very worthwhile. And for those of you in the audience, just a quick reminder, be with us on the 26th for that upcoming program on Broadway. I think you will adore it. So thanks to everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.